Do any of the remembering today.
No white person are going to brainwash me.
This gallery is in itself a work of art.
I'm surprised at how many people have a car. They won't let their wives drive it.
I sort of realised there aren't any people of colour in those departments.
Women in Australia retire with 35% less super than men, and we're sick of it. The system was never built for us, so Verve Super was. Verve was founded by women to support women to build wealth and invest in a better world, while we all work together for change, because super is power, and women deserve more of both. Verve, proud partner of All About Women 2021.
Warami, Walamabamai, Jubagali, Nora Gadigal Mujin, Gurgalwiri, Galgala Gui, Yaguna, Bariala, Banga Bujari, Gunyalum Yalum.
The Sydney Opera House acknowledges the lands of the Gadigal, and we welcome you to Jubagali, now known as Bennelong Point. The Sydney Opera House honours our First Nations by fostering a shared sense of belonging for all Australians. And we pay our deep respects to the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of Jubagali. Welcome to the Sydney Opera House and enjoy the show.
Here comes our presenter.
Hello everyone and welcome to How Smart is Artificial Intelligence. My name is Ray Johnston, I'm a STEM journalist, I'm the host of tech podcast Queens of the Drone Age, and I'm quietly becoming more concerned about my smart home devices listening to me. But I am also very happy to be your host for today. The first technologists were the sovereign First Nations peoples of this continent, their knowledge passed down through the generations of the oldest continuing cultures on Earth, despite attempts to erase them. And it's with that sentiment that I acknowledge we are standing on the unceded land of the Gadigal, and I pay my deep respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any of my First Nations aunties and uncles, brothers and sisters that may be here with us today. Now, artificial intelligence is a part of our everyday lives. It's also far from neutral because it's often built on misogynistic systems of power. In this session, I will be chatting with Kate Crawford, a leading academic, on the social and political implications of artificial intelligence. And then it will be over to you for questions, which we are doing a little bit differently this year. We'll be using Slido to collect them. So if you're seated in the venue or if you're at home, you can just go to any of your browsers, go to sli, that's sli.do, and you type in the event code all about women. Then you just need to select the venue that we're in right now, which is the Drama Theatre, and you'll be directed to the area where you can ask all of your questions. And if you see a question in there that you really like and definitely want it answered, you can upvote it so that I'll see it as well. And if at any point you'd like to share moments from today's talk, please do on social media and use the hashtag AllAboutWomen. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest. Over a 20-year career, she's held academic positions around the world. She co-founded the AI Now Institute in New York and is the inaugural chair of AI and Justice at the École Normale Supérieure. Her latest book is Atlas of AI, on power, politics, and the planetary costs of AI. Please welcome her to the stage, Kate Crawford. Thanks so much, Kate. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Hi, Ray. It is such a treat. And I love your entire podcast. So it's just a thrill to be here talking to you in person.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, your new book is called The Atlas of AI. And when I think of an atlas, I think of maps of our planet. And when I think of AI, I think of maths I can't see. So why do we need an atlas for artificial intelligence, and how does that even work?
Oh, look, you're exactly right. I mean, when we think about AI, we do think about math and code and numbers. But one of the things that has always really motivated my work has been thinking about the social, political, and even the ecological implications of large-scale computation. And it was funny, when I started doing this sort of research sort of over 15 years ago now, it struck me as really strange that artificial intelligence was really only understood in this very narrow way as a technical discipline. And if you looked at all of the AI institutes around the world, they were technical institutes. They would teach you how to code and design algorithms, but none of them were studying or even looking at what the implications might be if you use these systems in healthcare or in education or criminal justice, hiring. So it became really clear to me early on that we had to start looking at artificial intelligence in a much bigger scope. And the reason why I like the sort of the metaphor of the atlas is that atlases help us look at things at different scales. We can look at a scale of a planet, or we can zoom in to sort of a city or a mountain range. And for me, that's the right metaphor for how we think about the way that AI works. Because in every sense, it's using vast amounts of energy, minerals, but also human labour, and also data, primarily scraped off the internet. So I started to think about AI as this emerging extractive industry of the 21st century, almost in the same way that mining was the sort of emerging extractive industry of the 18th century. So that sort of required this idea of putting AI in a bigger landscape, and hence the idea of creating an atlas of AI.
Makes a lot of sense now when you explain it like that. Now, you've created an image that shows the life cycle of an Amazon Echo. How did you make this, and can we see it?
Yes, there is this picture. So this, I know it's probably not what you expect. If you've ever seen an Amazon Echo, it's just like a little cylinder that you probably sit on your kitchen bench or in your bedroom if you're not afraid of listening devices. And these devices are sort of designed so that you can do sort of essentially voice-enabled commands to an AI system. You can say, Alexa, what's the weather going to be today? Or Alexa, play my favourite song. And I was really interested in what does that moment of convenience cost us? What network do you summon into being by having that little interaction? And so I had the profound privilege of collaborating with a data visualizer by the name of Professor Vladan Jola. And he and I sat down one day and we were like, how would you visualize what essentially an Amazon Echo is doing? And so we started off with thinking about the data layer. So that's like the obvious piece down the middle. It's like all the data servers and the extraction farms and how you actually go through the process of analyzing vocal commands. But then we went, you have to think bigger than that. You have to go back to what are the components inside the box? Where do they come from? Where are they mined? Where are they smelted? How does that get from A to B? Where are the sort of the logistics and the shipping? And then what is the end of life of one of these devices over here? Is that they sort of end up in EWaste tips in Pakistan and Ghana and wherever people will take it. Actually, China used to take a lot of the EWaste until they decided it's too toxic, we won't do it anymore. And so it's really one of these things where countries that are sort of poor enough to say, all right, we'll take this sort of toxic sludge, are doing so. So we then mapped this whole thing as a gigantic life cycle from birth, life and death of a single Amazon Alexa. And then this piece kind of bizarrely took off. I mean, it's seen normally even larger than this. It's about sort of 7 meters by 5 meters. So you can sort of see any particular part of the cycle. And then it became sort of this piece that was shown in galleries around the world, which was really exciting.
It's in the Museum of Modern Art at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, well, actually, yeah, MoMA acquired it in their permanent collection, so it's there forever now. You'll be able to see it whenever you want.
And did the process of doing this change how you thought about AI?
Profoundly. I have to say, I mean, I count this project, which we started now over 5 years ago, as the genesis of really sort of my thinking now about artificial intelligence as an extractive industry. That, you know, AI doesn't work unless you have mining. It doesn't work unless you have sort of exploited labour throughout the supply chain, you know, from all of the parts of the world where these components are drawn from. And then in terms of labeling the data that's being harvested off the internet that will then be used to make all the devices work. So also just going through this process of researching all of the layers of what it takes to create global planetary compute was extraordinary because it's really hard. I'll be honest with you, it was extremely difficult to find out, you know, what are all the, you know, the rare earth minerals that go into a single Amazon Alexa, and, you know, where are the mines located, and what are the policies in terms of how much people are paid in those mines, or in some cases barely paid at all. And then to go through all of those parts of the supply chain, which are generally kept opaque. And that's the thing for so many of us when we try to think about AI, is that so much of it is kept at arm's length or is completely invisible in terms of understanding how it works. And that, to me, becomes more and more a democratic question. If we can't see how these things work, how can we judge when and how we should use them?
Yeah, and one of the things that we do know about AI is that there is a big gender bias within it. And we've seen this manifest in hundreds, if not thousands, of different ways. You know, women not being shown high-paying ads, you know, facial recognition technology not detecting the faces of women or colour, or detecting them inaccurately, and, you know, resulting in law enforcement situations which are entirely avoidable.
Yes.
We know that this happens, and we've known for years that this has been happening. So why is it still happening?
Well, this is a really important question, and particularly here at All About Women. And it was funny, actually, that Ray and I were sort of joking before the session about if you do a Google search on AI and you just click images to see all the images that you get for AI, this is what you get. You get robots, you get, like, you know, probably a circuit board. They all kind of look vaguely mannish, very white. So obviously the future is white robots. It's a whole new form of white supremacy. You have men in suits in front of control panels. You know, I mean, this is what it looks like. But in actual fact, what we get is much more like this, which is, you know, sort of not this sort of blue code neutral objective environment, but actually profoundly skewed systems that have been found to do things like, obviously, facial recognition systems that can't detect women of colour. We have Apple's credit card that was found to be giving men 80 times the credit of women for all applicants regardless of their financial status. And of course, Amazon's own AI system for scanning resumes, which they were trialling for a couple of years. And this system was used so that they didn't have to look at all of the resumes that people sent in. And it was found after testing this system for years, mind you, that all women were being downvoted by the system. If you even had the word woman on your CV, like coach of the women's soccer team, you would be put on the bottom of the pile. And you ask the question of why is this? Well, for me, the Amazon case is so powerful because you can it makes complete sense. They trained the AI system on the data of their previous successful applicants, their existing workforce. Guess what the gender representation is of the existing workforce of Amazon? Yeah, well, you're right. In the engineering side, it's over 85% male. And that's, I think, a generous Amazon estimate. So you can see if you train an AI system on the data of the past, you can actually build it into the systems of the future. You inculcate and embed those inequities to be perpetuated in an ongoing sense in time. And we have seen this time and time again in multiple cases. Now, I don't want to oversimplify. There are many ways in which bias creeps into systems. But certainly what we've learned is that it's sort of really primarily around these two big areas. And the first one is technical, and I'll just speak to that briefly. This is a sort of a visualization of ImageNet, which is sort of, one of the most well-known sort of databases that AI has sort of trained on and compared against. And this is really sort of on the technical side. To understand why we keep having these sexist and racist systems is you have to sort of look under the hood at the infrastructures of seeing. How is the world being seen and interpreted by technical systems? Well, we do it by training them on thousands, sometimes millions of pieces of data. It could be images, if it's an image system, or it could be text, if it's a language system. Where does that come from? It's scraped off the internet. So if you're scraping text off Reddit, where you've got, 15-year-old boys talking about, hilarious jokes about girls, that then becomes the textual basis of your system. If you're scraping it off, Yahoo News, which a lot of the sort of the early image databases came from, you'll get a sort of very celebrity-skewed kind of vision of what the world looks like. Again, very sort of white, dominant, male-dominant visions of the world. So at the technical level, we have to look at infrastructures and say that's part of the problem. But there's another problem too, which we don't talk about as much, which is the social side, which is who is in the rooms where we actually design AI systems. Who are the engineers who get to decide this is a problem that we can resolve with AI, and these are the people for whom this will work best. We also have to look at who runs these companies. I mean, if you've looked at the CEOs recently or the founders of, the biggest tech companies in the world, you know their names. It's Jeff Bezos, it's Mark Zuckerberg, it's all of the kind of the names that we know well from almost entirely white men.
Yeah.
And I think that has skewed the kinds of thinking and the kinds of priorities that these technical systems are serving. And obviously they're created to make a lot of money. And so, they're not here as civic infrastructures, but I think we commonly think they are. There's a mistake that we assume that, Facebook is really here just so that we can communicate with our friends and share news. Isn't that fantastic?
So great.
Until, of course, we get last week when, of course, they start having a fight with the Morrison government and decide to just switch off the tap. And then you realise, no, this is a private infrastructure, purely for profit. And as much as they have tried to, they've really spent a lot of money for us to believe that this is really there for our soccer clubs and our friends and our, student groups. But it's not. And this is the very big trap, I think, when we start to look at the way that we've come to rely on these as civic infrastructures.
Yeah, so there has been also a lot in the news lately I've seen about the ability of artificial intelligence to be able to look at our faces and read our innermost thoughts, feelings and emotions.
Yes, like this one. There was this one that came out, it was just last month. That claimed that this was an AI system that could read children's emotions as they learn. I'm curious, what have you been thinking about this one, Ray? Are you convinced?
I'm not convinced, I'm going to say. No, I think that especially in instances, when we're thinking about how women present themselves to the world, we've been trained a lot by society to hide how we're feeling in some instances. We're trained to be nice and polite and smile at people so that they don't, be mean to us or worse. So I don't think that there would really be an ability for an algorithm to be able to detect what we're feeling on the inside by just looking at clues on our face. That's my hunch.
And your hunch is exactly correct.
Yes.
But believe it or not, there is a $90 billion industry that is trying to sell you the opposite idea.
Why?
Which is that it can scan your face and detect one of 7 core emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, and of course, one bonus, neutral. And, you know, and it was funny to see these systems and to say, well, where does this come from? You know, first of all, where is this assumption that to look on someone's face is to know the true inner state of what they're feeling? I mean, as any of us, you know, would have ever smiled at a photographer when they're having a photo taken, we're like, this is not what I'm actually feeling.
I worked in hospitality for 15 years. I was not that happy, I tell you.
Exactly. Spot on, spot on. So, yet, nonetheless, there is this assumption that, you know, if we use machine learning to look at the micro expressions in your face, we can tell your true inner state. Now, this would be laughable, and we could sort of ignore it if it wasn't for the fact that these tools are now being built into, for example, HR and hiring. So at multiple big companies in the US, Goldman Sachs, Unilever, American Airlines, if you take a job interview, you are being recorded at the same time by one of these systems, and they are tracking the micro expressions in your face and then comparing your face and your expressions to a whole lot of these sorts of sort of 6-point scales of what emotions you're feeling, and then comparing that to successful applicants of the past. So you end up, of course, creating these echo chambers where you hire people who look and talk like the people that you've already hired. And of course, you know, for me as an academic, I'm always just like, where does this taxonomy come from? Where does this idea of 6 emotions and that the idea that, you know, you could read inside somebody's state? Well, actually, it goes back to the 1960s, and it really is, you know, this core idea was pioneered by one psychologist by the name of Paul Ekman. And bless him, you know, Paul Ekman, you know, he had this vision that he just said, look, I'm sure that there is this idea of universal emotions. And he'd had fights with anthropologists like Margaret Mead, who'd said, absolutely no, it's cultural, it's contextual, it's relational. Yeah. We change the way we look and emote depending who we're talking to and the context we're in. But he was like, no, I'm absolutely convinced there's just 6. And he sort of went on this mission, believe it or not, to Papua New Guinea, and he tried to find a remote tribe that hadn't been exposed to Western media so he could show them these cards and say, does this look, what emotion is this to you? And in fact, that first trip to Papua New Guinea was an epic failure. He'd never done cross-cultural research before, and so he didn't know how to work with a translator, and it ended up being this total mess where people were saying, what does he want with these 6 photos? Like, what is he trying to do? But ultimately, he kept doing these sets of studies over time and kept claiming that this was, you know, indeed a way you could simplify human emotion. And it's an idea that caught on. And it strikes me that the reason why it's caught on in artificial intelligence is because it's a theory that fits the tools. Machines can track certain patterns that repeat over time. It's just statistical pattern recognition. Oh, the mouth goes up, you must be happy. Oh, the mouth goes down, you must be sad. And so what we get, I think, are these kinds of really kind of problematic sort of mechanical interpretations of what it is to be human. And I think it really narrows the understanding of what it is to be embodied and emotional and relational. And it mistakes the external appearance for interior reality. But it wouldn't matter if these weren't being built into hiring and criminal justice and everything. I mean, these systems are having an impact right now.
That's terrifying. Yeah, if they were just existing as a, you know, a theory, an idea, something fun to play with, but the fact that it's being built into our future and will have real impacts on our lives and the opportunities that are available to us. So that is a little bit scary. Sorry, Kate.
Well, I mean, you know, I wish it were a happier story, but I mean, I think this is why it's important to have these sorts of discussions, because it strikes me that we have a pretty short window of, you know, really a few years to start pushing back on some of these presumptions. And in some of these cases, I see it as really problematic science. Often the science is faulty, but often the impacts of who sees the downsides of these systems is exactly what you think. It's women, it's people of colour, it's, you know, the economically marginalised. It's people who are already seen as somehow, you know, not the centre ideal, sort of the white man centre on which these systems are often designed and designed for. These are the people who experience the greatest downsides. So it is ultimately, in some ways, I see this as the civil rights issue of the next decade.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about having workplaces full of people that are essentially all the same, but robots taking our jobs. You hear that one a lot.
Yes.
as everything becomes more automated, as basic tasks are done by machines as opposed to people, there is this idea that labour will change, how labour looks in the future will change. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I think it is one of the most common stories that we hear about AI, is that AI is taking our jobs.
Yeah.
And,
Not mine, though. It's all good.
Yeah, exactly. You're good. You're fine. But it's interesting to see, the jobs that are seen to be sort of easily mechanised that will be replaced. And absolutely, we are seeing, certainly post-COVID or during COVID, a push towards automating as much of the workplace as possible to try and move away from human workers. So that is happening. But the other thing that I'm really interested about is what happens to these semi-automated, semi-human workplaces. And one of the things that I did for the book is that I got access to go inside one of Amazon's fulfillment centres, very fulfilling, where they sort of do distribution. It's the logistics nodes for Amazon. So I went inside one of the biggest ones on the east coast of America. This is in Robbinsville in New Jersey. And it was kind of extraordinary because the minute you go in, you're aware of the robots. So they have Kiva robots that are kind of moving across the floors and carrying these huge stacks of all of the things that we order from Amazon. But then you have the people. And the people almost sort of so frequently, everyone's wearing safety vests, but some people, have bandages, support bandages. You can see lots of, sort of repetition strain injury support bandages on people as they're doing the work of picking and sorting all of the objects that we buy. Now, it's one thing to sort of enjoy the convenience of Amazon, but for me it was really quite shocking to see sort of the physical toll. And that physical toll is algorithmically mediated. There is a system they use inside of all of Amazon's distribution nodes worldwide called the rate. And what that means is that if you're a picker, and a picker is a person who gets the things out of trays and then puts them in another tray to go into the bag to go to the person, as you're picking, there's a screen in front of you which tells you if you're picking fast enough relative to your other pickers and relative to the rate. And the rate is algorithmically determined. And if you fall behind the rate, you get penalised. If you get penalised a certain number of times, you get fired. Ooh. So you're kind of working against this rate all the time. And I was, talking to workers who said, I've been trying to skip meal breaks, and it's so stressful because I'm trying to keep up this rate. Because again, the rate is sort of algorithmic representation of sort of the profit imperatives of Amazon. And so you sort of see these spaces and you say, this is not AI, human, augmented collaboration. No. This is an extreme time and sort of physical pressure that's being forced on people through these kinds of part robotic, part algorithmic environments. So in some ways I see these spaces as the metaphor of what work is looking like. It's people under sort of forced conditions of increased surveillance, increased time pressure, sort of algorithmic determinations of efficiency. And I see them as a really cautionary tale of how we have to think very carefully about the use of AI in the workplace.
It's like the message that they're sending to those people is, prove to me that we shouldn't just replace you with one of the robots that you're seeing going past you.
Well, exactly right. And what you might have noticed just this week is that there has been a huge move by Amazon workers to unionise. Yeah. And Amazon has been pushing against this in subtle and unsubtle ways for years, including...
Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, can't he afford to pay his workers properly?
Phenomenally. I'm so wealthy that it's just... And he got so much wealthier during COVID. It's just mind-blowing the amount of wealth this man has. He could easily give everybody, a pay rise to be getting, $100,000 a year if he wanted to. In a second, it would never touch his wealth reserves. So, I mean, it's an extraordinary example of the kinds of unevennesses and injustices and why thinking about labour rights in an AI environment is going to be so important.
Yeah. So this is one of the places that you travelled to
yes.
while creating this atlas, but you also travelled to places where, as you spoke about earlier, the raw materials of AI are being extracted.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the environmental piece. And the funny thing is, I feel like this is the least told story when it comes to artificial intelligence. They have this impression of being a green and sort of planet-friendly industry because it's just math, it's just code,
Just blue and white robots.
It's just blue and white robots, in the air, in the cloud. It's not doing anything. But it's truly one of the most energy-intensive industries we have. Before COVID, just data centres alone were starting to beat out the airline industry for having the largest carbon footprint. Post-COVID, much greater than the airline industry. So, I mean, if you look at the use of data and things like Netflix and everything, just the fact that we've moved online at such such a dramatic rate around COVID, of course, just seeing the amount of energy that's being spent by planetary compute is shocking. So one of the things that I did for the Atlas is I wanted to visit the locations where you would see extraction, not just for energy, but also for the minerals that go into the creation of sort of the physical material realities of building everything from computers, devices, and sort of all of the back-end parts of data centers. So I went to this place. This is Silver Lake in Nevada, in the Clayton Valley. And this is the last functioning lithium mine in the United States because there's no lithium left. It's all been mined out. This is the last one. Now, the reason why this is a hotly contested piece of land is because, of course, lithium is essential. It's the only thing we have got for rechargeable lithium-ion batteries. Now, lithium-ion batteries are in almost everything that you use, which is sort of in the technical systems that we understand, from our phones to our Amazon Echoes, even to our electric vehicles. So EVs, take a Tesla, takes around 60 kilograms of this material of lithium straight out of the earth. And unfortunately, we have very limited reserves. There are sort of various reserves around the world, but they're dwindling. And a recent report has just shown that depending if we figure out a way to recycle lithium-ion batteries, which, by the way, we suck at, we have extremely low rates because they're very toxic, very difficult to recycle. If we don't fix that problem, we're going to run out of lithium somewhere between 2040 if we don't recycle, or 2100 if we do.
Wow.
And this is we don't have another way of actually thinking about sort of, rechargeable batteries. Yeah. This is not a thing that we can do yet. So we're looking at the real sort of end of life cycle where there are many sort of minerals in the chain of how we do large scale compute that are really reaching a point where we're going to just use them up. And so going to this place and sort of thinking about how long we have to sort of just use these things as though they're infinitely replaceable, I think that logic has had its day. I think it's done. I think it's time to look at why artificial intelligence is part of a much broader system of computation that is really one of the biggest environmental risks that we have right now. And so there's been lots of papers that have been coming out just recently, very controversially, by a couple of Google researchers, again, looking at just the energy costs of doing natural language processing AI, which again is shocking. People don't know about this. So I think this is, again, one of the big stories that for me was mind-blowing, researching the Atlas of AI and going to the places and just realizing this is it, this is all we have, and there's not going to be another reserve that we just discover. And if not, we're in big trouble.
And yet, at the same time, we've got such a huge push to, electric vehicles, and
precisely
the technology of the future is using a lot of these batteries.
That's it. And again, it's that sense you're like, oh, we've all got electric vehicles now. We did the right thing. It's the right thing for the planet. But guess what? Then we have another problem, which is that we're relying on these sort of dwindling reserves of lithium. So I think to some degree, the lesson here is so many of these questions are kept at arm's length and are kept invisible and hidden. And without looking at them, you can't really make decisions about what you do or what's worth doing. But I also don't want to make this sound like it's a consumer choice story. It's not. It's not like, oh, just choose the right compute platform and suddenly you're doing it the green way.
Remote control. We'll all be fine, folks.
Exactly. No. It's a much bigger question about how we are sort of creating systems that are fundamentally unsustainable.
Absolutely. Now, you end the book with a discussion about the modern-day space race between our friend Bezos and Elon Musk. Why did you end it there? Are you telling me something about where the future of AI is headed? Because from what you've said, AI in space is just another layer of terrifying now.
I hadn't actually thought of that. It's like, what will AI look like in space? For me, it's like looking at the ultimate extension of the ideology of artificial intelligence, right? Which is this myth that we can kind of produce enormous efficiencies and sort of forget the kind of legacies of extraction that these tools are based on. So it strikes me as not a coincidence that the men who made their fortunes from artificial intelligence, so many of them, are all now focused on leaving the Earth. So I think it's a hint, right? I think they're telling us something. And it's extraordinary when you really look at sort of, so one of the things I did was sort of, go to Jeff Bezos's reusable rocket launch facility in West Texas, where you can sort of go and sort of see the base. And I also looked at all of this as it is here. It's in this huge kind of Permian basin, this ancient landscape in the desert in West Texas. And of course, it's very hard to see. This is a sort of a shot at long distance from public land. But all of the ideology around Blue Origin, which is the name of his company, is that, the Earth is running out of resources. We have to maintain growth. And the only way we can do that is by going into space and mining asteroids and actually creating off-world colonies where humans can live. And we leave the Earth, presumably, for the occasional visit for the very wealthy. But the vision of the future is so astoundingly terrifying to me, which is complete abrogation of responsibility and ultimately a departure from the Earth entirely. It's like, we've used it, it's used up, time's running out, we have to leave. And to me, there's just something so shocking about that as the end point of these great technologists' vision. It's just not about how do we find a way to make this planet sustainable. It's the only one that really does work for us. But we have to, again, invest in this imaginary, this fantasy of living on Mars, which, of course, is Elon Musk's version, when we simply don't have any technology currently available that would even allow us to do that. To get there, let alone to live on a planet as inhospitable as Mars.
It's nonsense, folks. It's nonsense.
So, but it's extraordinary that this nonsense is so powerful.
Yeah.
And again, it's to me, it's a type of ideology that, again, it's like, oh, it's innovation, it's space, it's excitement, it's showmanship.
Space is exciting and fun.
Precisely. It sounds great, absolutely. Science fiction is great too. But, it strikes me we have some real world issues that we really should be investing all those billions and all of that engineering thought and time on the planet we actually have. And to me, that's not just an ecological politics, but it's also a feminist politics. I mean, this is something that, feminists have said for a very long time, is thinking about our relationship to other people, our relationship to other beings, and our relationship to the Earth. And that is something that has so fallen away from the highly male-dominated AI and space race that I think it's an incredibly important moment to start questioning these politics. To start, what is the politics that would say, let's automate everything and then abandon Earth? Because that's really, if you lay it out, that's the logic of these industries right now.
And when you do consider just the sheer amount of funds and resources at the fingertips of these men, the choices that they could make that would benefit the Earth and the people on the Earth, the fact that they're looking elsewhere instead, I'm angry at them, Kate.
Well, again, you're talking about the most extraordinary aristocracy that you really have to go very far back in history to find anything like the smallest number of kings and queens that you would find right now in terms of thinking of the great houses of AI. I mean, you're really talking about sort of fewer than a dozen companies worldwide that can do planetary compute, and of that, really only 2 or 3 are dominant. And when you think about the super billionaires, another list came out just this month that showed of the top 10 richest men, and they are men, in the world, the top 6 all come from big tech. So, I mean, to see that shift again from the traditional extractive industries of oil and gas, now, which again were previously the sources of great wealth for the very few, that's really shifted to big tech in the last 25 years. And it's at a time in our planet's history where I think our awareness is growing that we cannot sort of rely on systems that are ultimately just making this planet less and less inhabitable. So I hate to say it, but there are good reasons to be angry, but I also think that for me, writing this book was about actually connecting with an optimistic vision of how we actually have to change. We have to change our thinking. We have to change the questions we ask when we just, are presented with technical systems that will supposedly make everything objective, neutral, more efficient, that we actually have to push against those sorts of, I think, just assumptions and to say, how do these systems work? What are they taking from us? And what are these longer-term planetary consequences of how they work?
But to be able to ask those questions, we need to have access to the information about it. And this needs to be presented in a way that we can easily understand and take in, and it needs to be not thought about as an abstract thing that doesn't have an impact on our lives. How do we make sure that people are engaged with thinking about this and not shying away from it as a big, scary, complicated, hard to understand topic.
Exactly right. I mean, to me, that is the biggest political mission that I think we could possibly have. If you're in the space of AI right now, it is a responsibility to be making these systems plain and comprehensible to the people who will be most affected by them. And that means we have to be having more public debates like this. We have to be sort of, opening up the boxes of AI to say, here's how these things function, here's where they fail, and here's why they fail, and here's who they're failing for. Because again, it's predominantly the people who are already marginalized who are experiencing the worst downsides of these systems. And the other thing for me, I have to say, is, I started out as an academic 20 years ago, and you're taught to write scientific papers, and you're taught to sort of go to academic conferences, and that's fantastic. That's an important part of what we do. But, over the years, I've realized that it's much more important socially that this work is actually done in public in ways that we can have these sorts of public discussions. And also one of the things that's been really important to me is putting it in cultural spaces. Yeah. If you think about the numbers of us who would go to an event at the Opera House, or you might go to a museum like the Smithsonian, or you might go to the Whitney, is to think about how might we actually start using arts and culture to represent how AI works. And this is an example from an exhibition that I did with the artist Trevor Paglen, where we spent 2 years looking at all of the most sort of common training sets that are used to teach AI systems to quote unquote see the world. And it was extraordinary because we saw the logics built into these databases in terms of detecting race and gender, where some of these things only assume that there's only 2 genders, male or female, or that there are 4 race categories, believe it or not. I mean, these are ideas that have been, were debunked in the sort of 18 and 1900s that are returning in AI. And then we created these sort of big installations inside the Fondazione Prada in Milan so people could come and see and actually look at these systems and see these broken logics. And I think in many ways the politics that underlie them. And then to realize, okay, these are the databases that are training how AI works. So it's a nice way, I guess, of making the stakes feel both material, you can understand them, but also allowing you a voice to say, okay, I actually have some concerns about how this is working. And I think that's the piece that we need, is to sort of move AI away from this highly technocratic, highly esoteric debate to, okay, what does the system do? What is it trained on? How does it affect people differentially? And how are we going to govern it? And how are we going to regulate it? Because guess what? That's the one great gap, I think, of the last 20 years of AI is all of this technical innovation. And what have we done with regulation? Almost nothing. And so that, for me, is one of the most urgent issues that we face really just in the next couple of years, is to really address how to regulate AI.
So if we want to change those training sets that these companies are using, these image banks that put races in 4 categories, how does that happen? Are we just lobbying the people at the top? How does that change actually occur? Do we make our own data sets and go, there you go, use that, I pulled that together for you?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I've done projects like that in the past. I did a project called Data Sheets for Data Sets with many colleagues. We really just basically said, look, it's extraordinary that people just use these training sets and there's not even a little guide at the front that says, here's where we got this data from, or here's what it represents, or here are some of the privacy concerns you might have reusing it, or some of the, that didn't even exist. And so, we wrote a paper about this, and now several companies are using this, but I want to be really clear, I think that's too narrow. Because the objective here isn't just how do we demographically balance the faces so that we have, people of all skin tones, or how do we make sure we have, 25 categories for gender instead of 2. All of these things, I think, are fundamentally arbitrary and ultimately very narrow, because you're saying, how do we tweak a technical system so that it's not so obviously biased or obviously broken? But I think we need to step back and say, how do we think about who these systems serve? Do they, in some ways, actually just serve the powerful? If we look at systems for policing and, systems that are used for sort of, just rampant profit making, and are they actually deepening inequality? And if so, we need to sort of start asking those bigger questions about power, ultimately. It's about AI and power rather than about trying to tweak technical systems to be, slightly improved.
Yeah. We do now have some time for questions from the audience. So just a reminder, head to sli.do, sli.do, type in the event code, All About Women. That's all one word, and select the drama theatre. That's where we are, and ask away. And while I switch to those questions...
Don't you miss the feeling where you could just put your hand up?
Put your hand up and ask a question. I go, you over there, what are you going to say?
I love that.
Good thing here, though, is we can get questions from people at home too. No, we did touch on, the bias that exists within AI, and often that one of the reasons for this is that the people that are making these systems, the people that are in the room, the human element, they're not very diverse themselves.
Yeah.
But from your experience, you've worked in this field for a really long time, what actually needs to change within the industry and within these companies to make them a more welcoming place for women to work? Because I see all of these programs. We have coding camps for girls to, stop any kind of gender bias at an early age, and we're supporting young women with mentoring programs, and then we're pushing them into workplaces that are still, the vast majority of them are men, and women are experiencing all sorts of harassments within those workplaces at much higher rates than other people, and in particular women of colour.
Yep.
How do we change things at that level so that we're not just throwing everyone to the wolves?
Right. I mean, this is something I know that you and I are both really passionate about, which is that there was a real sort of tendency, I think, in the last decade to say, oh, we just need girls to code. We'll create coding camps and then we'll just throw them into this industry and everything will be better, without any thought about, what was that industry like to work in? What was the sort of lived experience of being in these industries? And what we've had time and time again are just extraordinary accounts of women being marginalised, being harassed, being made to feel less than sort of their male counterparts, and the racial dynamics are really quite extreme, and to the point where we've had tech companies, Google as the most recent example, who have had such a problem with diversity and inclusion that they've poured millions of dollars into these programs that have achieved very little, that have been deeply criticised by people inside Google, and it have just been seen as profoundly ineffective. And of course now we've just in the last few days seen that there's been a big suit that's been brought against Amazon for alleged discrimination against black and female employees throughout their kind of corporate structures. So I mean, this is not going away. This is a very serious problem, and so to me, we haven't looked enough at how these workplaces function, rather than assuming that women were the problem. It's like, oh, we just need women to code. The other thing that sort of was really chilling to me, this happened a few years ago, some of you might remember, back in 2017, James Damore, who was an engineer based at Google, wrote a memo which basically was a screed saying that Google should spend nothing on diversity and inclusion, because the reason why there weren't women, or enough women, working at the company was because women were just biologically ill-suited to computer science. Their brains were different. That was why. And as laughable as it sounds to us, that actually represents a growing minority of people who believe that, well, actually, biology is destiny, we know women shouldn't really be in computer science, white people are more intelligent than black people. It's this really disturbing sort of turn to a very profoundly sort of patriarchal, misogynistic, and I think deeply racist sense of logics. And I think it really became empowered under Trump. So, the last 4 years have really seen a rise of that sort of thinking, and it's just been off the leash. It's just been like, under Trump, you could say and think these sorts of things that would previously be seen as pretty on the nose. And it's created a real hostility in workplaces. I think it's something that is, not talked about enough, but I think it's a real problem at the moment. So it's a moment of reckoning, I think, for the entire tech sector to say, how is it going to address sort of the rise of these sorts of really problematic beliefs around sort of biological determinism and, again, the sort of racism and misogyny.
Yeah, I've heard your nails are too long, they'd hit the wrong keys.
Oh, yes, there you go. That's why we went, right, shouldn't be in computer science. Right.
Don't go near a computer if you've got long nails. It's not for you.
Right.
All right.
Shocking.
So I do have an anonymous question here. What are you most hopeful or optimistic about for the future when it comes to AI, especially for women? Please give us something.
Well, I have to say it, it's funny, because you hear just so much rah marketing hype about AI, it's important to actually do the real talk about how these things actually work. But believe it or not, I'm actually a closet optimist, and here's why. I know it's hard to believe, but in some ways, and perhaps it's because of the journey that I've been on to really understand these systems, that by looking at artificial intelligence, because it touches on these issues, it touches on issues of racial and gender inequality, it touches on issues of essentially climate justice, it touches on issues of labour rights, it touches on issues of data protection, that in some ways it becomes this very important nexus where we could talk about the most important political issues that we face, ultimately. I mean, this is it. So what I see is really exciting in the debates around AI and the communities who work on these issues is that they're starting to work together. We're starting to see sort of a new political uprising around that talks about climate justice, labour rights, and data protection together. That says we have to think about these things together in order to produce more sustainable technologies, but also more sustainable ways to live. That it's bigger than just technology. And to me, that is the most important thing that we're going to have in this moment, is that how does it change the way we think about politics, and how do we bring different coalitions together to address these core fundamental problems. So that's the piece that I hope that cheers you up, but what that means is that this is the call to action. This means it's for us, and it really is for us to see this as the political issue of our time.
Got another question here. Laura Bates talked about YouTube algorithms skewing viewing of teenagers, leading to greater radicalisation. Mm-hmm. How can we challenge these algorithms?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because if you think about how algorithms were sort of really designed in YouTube, it is maximised for screen time, which is to keep you watching as long as possible. And how do you keep people watching as long as possible? Well, first of all, you give them what they already like. So if it can see, oh, you like this sort of stuff, give them more of that. But also you want to keep them excited. It's got to get more exciting and more extreme. So it's got to be like, you saw that, but now see this. Yep. It's like even bigger, even better. So you can see those advertising logics have created a kind of curve in sort of content triggering and sort of content curation, which is sort of around how do you create these kinds of extremes. Now, at the same time, I don't want to make it sound that simplistic because, of course, it is an advertising logic, and advertisers don't want to be seen against, what happened in Christchurch. They don't want to be seen against sort of, episodes of people being harmed. They don't want to see it in relation to, really extreme forms of horror. So there are some breaking points there too. But certainly the issues around algorithmic recommendation have been one of the biggest problems in terms of what it's created in terms of these kinds of ecologies of hyper-extremism. And I have to say, lots of people are working on this. Yeah. It is not an area which is, you could throw a rock and there are teams working on it right now. But certainly I think it's interesting because it takes us right back to what you were saying, Ray. It's tempting to say, oh, technically, can we fix that? Well, yeah, you can, but you're still going to have this underlying commercial logic of, well, then how do we keep you watching? What are we going to do next there? So you can see that a lot of these issues are not just technical, but they're really much more sort of socio-technical and commercial. Mm.
What are some pointers for designers and coders to make AI inclusive?
Well, look, I think that, at the moment, let's just say there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. It's an extremely low bar at the moment. Frankly, I think there's a great space for people to almost sort of start thinking quite radically about, well, if this is how we're using AI, how might we use it differently? Rather than using AI to kind of track down immigrants in the US, why don't we use it to try and, expose police violence in the US? I mean, these are the sorts of flips that I think many designers are now working with. But I think we always have to kind of get back to the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, and the sort of classic Audre Lorde idea that, do we actually have to think at a more fundamental level around how these algorithms understand the world? And there's some really fundamental thinking at the level of how we're doing the basic statistical interpretations that I think is sort of the next big wave. It's like, are there ways to actually resist some of these sort of forms of classification that say we must classify people into sort of, race and gender and sexuality and criminality, these AI systems that claim to be able to predict these things for you. These are just tools that shouldn't be made. And there are so many good problems that we could be working on right now. So again, that is my hope. That I'll give you another sort of weird example. One of the things that's been interesting is, under COVID, when there was sort of so few people on the streets of major cities, that all of the facial recognition cameras, there were people who were sort of looking at these systems and saying, oh, we're actually recording lots more animals now, because the animals sort of wandering the street. And then people were like, why don't we just start using this to track rare and endangered species and try and protect those ecologies? So, I mean, what a good use of these sorts of recognition technologies, rather than, again, trying to sort of track down dissidents or, immigrants. So again, it's like, how do we start to shift the priorities rather than just the tools?
There was an example of a technology like that being used by rangers in the national parks. They're flying drones over areas where they know koalas have been, and the drones are equipped with cameras that, then, fed into an AI that can recognise the outline of koalas as opposed to possums or, birds or other animals in the tree, so they can more accurately get numbers of the koalas in different areas. So we can use it for good. It can be a good thing. Now, you mentioned e-waste being absorbed by developing countries. Do you see AI, without intervention, accelerating global health inequalities?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it already is. I mean, I think, again, one of the great tragedies of where we are in the history of compute is the hardware story, because we've had so little thought given to what we would do with this enormous and rapidly growing amount of e-waste. If you just think about how many phones you've had in your life and how many laptops you've had, I mean, those numbers are really quite shocking when you times that over populations of billions. And we haven't thought about where we're going to put it or what we do with it. And again, they leak all forms of toxins. I mean, there's this, one of the things I looked at for the Atlas was there is this sort of lake in Mongolia, which is a black toxic lake, which is just the dumping ground of all of these e-waste tips that have been sort of running into this huge lake. And these are the legacies. We're literally terraforming the earth with the legacies of e-waste. And again, it's something that I think is something we'll be living with for certainly for generations until we can figure out a much better way to be dealing with how we construct and use hardware.
Another question here. Early on, women were prevalent in data and computer development. Example, human computers. How did they get blocked out, and how do we get them back in?
I love this question. Thank you. And let me give a shout out.
Susie.
Let me give a shout out to the historian Ma Hicks, who also wrote one of my favourite books on this topic, really looking at sort of women themselves were called computers, the people who were doing data entry. And again, if you look at the sort of histories of the 1960s and 1970s, women played a much bigger role in developing computers and actually sort of, understanding and building these systems. And so what happened, I think, is very similar to what happens to sort of other industries when suddenly they become very popular and have a lot of money associated with them. And we saw this again with Wall Street. When suddenly there's a lot of money in a field, you start to see them become increasingly male-dominated and women get pushed out. And so again, we've seen exactly the same thing happen in computer science. If you look at the sort of, again, the gender numbers in sort of the 1980s and the 1990s were sort of much closer to we're getting closer to parity. It was more like 60-40, and now it's become extremely male-dominated again. And I think that is, really gets down to, the way that we have constructed these industries, what is being prioritised, and the way in which, again, we sort of value or don't value women's work. And I think that has to change, and that fundamentally has to change. But the histories show us that those industries are plastic. They do shift. It's not biology. It's not, women's brains, meaning they don't want to go to computer science. So I think there is certainly a space to start thinking again about, those gender politics of who gets hired into these companies and why.
How dangerous are Facebook, Google Home and other devices that listen in the long term? Thank you for whoever asked this so I can get the answer.
We see, I love this because, you might have previously thought before a session like this that we were talking about, dangerous because they're listening to you. But now you might say dangerous we might think about, are they dangerous to the environment? Are they dangerous to the labour conditions of how they're produced? But certainly if we just try to take it from the data side, how is this data being used? Well, we've had some horror stories where, initially it was like all of this data is never going to be heard by a person, it's being collected and it's completely private. And then there were multiple instances by several companies where it was found that, yes, people were actually listening to, humans were listening to things that were being discussed around in-home devices in order to fine-tune how they worked, right? So, of course, they're not private. And then, of course, you'd have to think about the enormous state surveillance infrastructures that can actually access. And again, this was the story that we learned from the Snowden archives, is that one of the other things I did for Atlas was actually spend time, thanks to the filmmaker Laura Poitras, with the Snowden archives and looking at the complete parallel universe of artificial intelligence in the military, and specifically the intelligence agencies. I mean, that is where so many of these capacities have been developed over multiple decades. And to see the way those tools, certainly when the Snowden archives came out, I think 6 years ago now, when they were sort of first released, have now sort of moved very much into the commercial space and are being used in sort of domestic devices, are being used in kind of, police settings. I mean, that devolution of essentially, high-grade intelligence agency extra legal tools, which are designed to be extra legal. They're designed to go beyond what you should be doing legally with, the way that you access telecommunications and data, and now being used by companies like Palantir and sold to companies. So we have, some real, I think, again, this is a question of this sort of shift from the way that these tools were first designed to be used in particular contexts, and they've now devolved to this municipal kind of local government level and, essentially small companies being able to use these tools. And we saw that with Clearview AI, again, sort of harvesting tools and doing facial recognition at a scale the NSA would have been delighted to be able to do that as recently as 10 years ago. So the speed of change here is sort of extraordinary as well. But I think a long way of answering your question, is it dangerous? The question is, what are you most afraid of? What's your threat model? And I think for me, the bigger concern is, what do we expect these systems to do and who do they serve? And often it's rarely us.
One quick one before we go. Knowing everything that we know, where is the optimism? Where is the hope? Give me something happy here.
Here's the hope. The hope is that nothing is inevitable. We're often told this story that technology is inevitable. Of course it's going to come. This is the latest thing. Of course you have to use it. You don't. All of these systems can actually be rejected, and there are zones of real pushback and refusal now. I'm sure many of you have seen the stories around facial recognition. We've seen multiple cities around the world pass ordinances to say, we don't want facial recognition here. We see it as toxic to just civil society. And that's profound. It's still early days, but we're starting to see these positions of saying, no, these tools aren't meant to be designed to be used everywhere. They're actually very specific for specific contexts, and there are ways to say that's enough is enough, and we can actually regulate them and we can contain them. And so that, I think, is one of the great things to take from this moment in history, is to say, you don't have to accept these systems, and we have this window to create real change. And that's something that we have to do collectively.
Thank you so much, Kate, for your time. Thank you all for coming to watch and for your questions. Kate's book, The Atlas of AI, you can pre-order it online now and it will hit shelves in April. So if you want to know more about this, I highly recommend picking up a copy. Thank you all for today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
And happy International Women's Day.